This installment of the Anguilla Financial Services Commission's FinTech and Compliance webinar series was recorded on location at Spyglass Hill Villa in Anguilla, British West Indies.
So today my name is Tina Bryan, Director of Anguilla Financial Services Commission. I have with me Marisa Harding-Hodge from the Ministry of Finance in Anguilla. Welcome, Ms. Harding-Hodge.
Good afternoon, Tina. Glad to be here this afternoon.
Nice to have you. Now, Ms. Harding-Hodge is currently the Principal Assistant Secretary of Finance in the Ministry of Finance and Health. In this capacity, she assists the Permanent Secretary of Finance in the management of the finance portfolio under the ministry. She previously held the post of Compliance Manager, where she amassed a wealth of experience in the development of policies relating to the exchange of information in international tax matters. Ms. Harding-Hodge is an economist by training, holding a BSc in Economics at the University of London and an MSc in Management and Strategy in Managerial Economics from the London School of Economics. So today, Marisa, we will be discussing the topic economic substance and the simple solutions in Anguilla to compliance. We are aware basically that Anguilla have made some amendments to its legislation and that this was important in terms of meeting international standards. And Anguilla's approach has been one where it has been more of a user-friendly framework in comparison to other jurisdictions. Could you give me a background or speak to the process in terms of what has unfolded thus far?
Mm-hmm. Okay, Tina. So happy to do that. The legal framework for the substance, for the substance requirements, as you would have mentioned, Anguilla wanted to take a user-friendly approach. We wanted to make sure it folded seamlessly in our regime and our current compliance framework. So we haven't created a standalone piece of legislation to address the substance requirements. Instead, it's folded into the existing formation legislation. So that is the legislation that these entities are registered or formed under. So for the relevant entities, for the entities which are subject to the substantial activities requirements, we have the International Business Companies Act, we have the Limited Liabilities Companies Act, we have the Limited Partnerships Act, and also we have the Companies Act. So the substantial activities requirements are enshrined within those pieces of legislation through amendment to those acts. And we wanted to ensure that the obligations for notifying the registrar of whether you conducting activities or whether you're not conducting relevant activities is done during the usual processes of the annual filing obligations. So it's a relatively simple framework. As part of the annual return process, you declare to the registrar whether you're conducting substance activities, and if you're not, then that's it. It's a simple exercise where you say, no, not conducting relevant activities. Obviously, there will be verifications and monitoring as part of the wider framework, but it's a relatively simple annual declaration if you're not conducting substance. On the other hand, if you are one of those entities and you are conducting relevant activities, then it will be a different process. It will require more information to be provided, but still a simple process by allowing it to be part of the annual return. So it's one deadline per year rather than trying to meet an economic substance deadline and then you still have your ordinary annual filing.
So that sounds like a very straightforward process, and I'm sure service providers have welcomed that. Has there been any feedback in terms of how service providers are actually viewing this process?
So in terms of Anguilla's solution to the substantial activities requirement, what was important from day one, the minister's government wanted to make sure that the industry was involved from the ground up. Mm-hmm. So even before any legislation was amended, on a continuous basis, there is industry participants on the team that's working together with delivering Anguilla's solution to the substantial activities requirement. So what was important for our private sector partners was that this leans on our existing framework. So they wanted to ensure that, okay, the current system, the current electronic solution that we have, which is the ACON platform, everyone knows it, everyone's familiar with it. It's Anguilla's commercial online registration network. So that is what we now use to register and incorporate companies. So the filing of the returns is through that. The system is accessed by company managers. So companies do not directly access it to incorporate or to submit their annual returns. They go through their registered agents. So that process is maintained. So we respect our existing framework, and we make it simpler, because by relying on our registered agents, we ensure a certain quality of the information, certain correctness and completeness, which we want to ensure that we obtain.
Okay, you mentioned some work with the service providers. Have they mentioned any resistance in terms of the clients, whether or not there has been some sort of pushback in terms of the economic substance regime?
I think with any change, persons are reluctant to change. Some persons, they're naturally in opposition to change, human nature. With this regime, I think it's been more so a question of the uncertainty around the framework. Persons have just been uncertain about what the implications, whether they're in scope, if they are, how do they demonstrate it, whether there's been concerns, and that's natural, that's expected. So what we've tried to do as much as possible is to get information out there, to make it easily accessible, to obtain information, to obtain access to the laws. We provided those online. We've released draft guidance. Even in terms of the guidance, we went into public consultation for the guidance. We wanted to make sure that what we provide delivers on persons' expectation, it covers their concerns, it addresses all the information that they wanted to know. So we went to a public consultation on that draft in May. We've received comments, and we're pretty much ready to release the guidance shortly, the finalized guidance on that.
You mentioned guidance, and I think I've had a brief review of that. I think within the guidance itself, it speaks to adequate and appropriate. Could you sort of speak more in terms of those two particular terms and how they are seen in terms of the actual guidance put forward?
So those two terms, the inclusion in the guidance was actually a particular request from the industry stakeholders. They said, okay, persons are concerned because the substantial activities requirements speak to adequate full-time employees, adequate physical assets, adequate operating expenditure. So persons wanted to know about what is adequate, or it would speak to appropriate qualifications for the full-time employees. So originally we would have disseminated information that it's just, okay, the normal, natural, ordinary meaning of the words. And that still is the case. However, the draft guidance would have provided some expanded information just to clarify that when we're talking about adequate, we're talking about as much as would have be ordinarily expected and stuff like that. But as it says in the guidance, we can't possibly be prescriptive in terms of what is adequate. Businesses vary by size, by nature. What might be appropriate for a financial institution, which is a deposit-taking institution, it might vary by its nature. A small institution might have a storefront with cashiers receiving deposits. You might expect a certain number of employees based on the number of deposits held, the volume of deposits, but that varies between organizations. So we do repeat the original guidance that it's the natural and ordinary meaning. It's as to be ordinarily interpreted, but we want to echo and stress that persons are not expected to have more substance, not expected to unnecessarily inflate the number of full-time employees that is more than is expected or required for the nature of their business activities. It's just what fits that business solution to demonstrate substance in Anguilla in relation to their conduct of relevant activities.
Okay, excellent. The draft guidance, do you have an idea as to when it will be completed, roughly in terms of a time frame?
So Anguilla would have committed to implementing the substantial activities requirements in relation to a commitment made to the EU. So through this process, what has been paramount and important is ensuring that any proposed framework or regime for Anguilla meets the requirements and is satisfactory to the EU member states. So we would have provided that draft guidance to the EU for comment, for their review, their technical review, and we would have received those that review at the end of last month. So we want to make those incorporate those suggested adjustments that they did provide, provide it back to them for final comment, and after that it will be released immediately.
Okay, can you speak to the availability of local resources in terms of implementing economic substance?
I think, and if you allow me to say, Tina, I think that was one of the important points that we should mention about the substantial activities requirement, and as it relates to Anguilla. Persons are looking, okay, yes, it's something to comply with, it's an additional obligation, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for service providers to enhance their offering, their services offering, and we have capable service providers here ready and willing to provide certain additional services to their clients. Now, the legislation itself allows for outsourcing of SIGAs. So SIGAs is the core income generating activities. So that's what you must demonstrate, the conduct of SIGAs to meet the substance requirements. So, and the outsourcing of SIGAs is allowed within Anguilla. So, and we have persons in Anguilla, qualified persons, an abundance of qualified persons capable of providing solutions to your business needs. So we're definitely encouraging persons, clients, to see this as an opportunity to further their investment in Anguilla.
Certainly, I like that in terms of a positive approach, in terms of taking to the next level. I know there have been some talk in terms of the service providers having some particular queries or that they would want clarification on. And one in particular has been in terms of holding companies. Could you speak to that as to whether or not those are in scope?
So first and foremost, we have to point out that holding companies has a particular definition in the legislation now. The holding companies that is referred to in the legislation is pure equity holding companies. So holding companies that I guess the colloquial sense of the word, holding companies that hold a variety of assets and earn a variety of income from those assets would not fall within that definition. If those types of companies that are holding a variety of assets with a variety of income, if they're conducting relevant activities, which is other than holding company business, they would be subject to meeting the SIGAs and meeting the economic substance test in relation to those activities. But for pure equity holding companies, which is the holding companies referred to in the law, then they have a reduced substance test. So for those types of holding companies, which is the definition under the law, the pure equity holding companies, they just have to meet the statutory filing requirements, and they have to have appropriate physical premises and adequate full-time employees for managing the equity participations. So an example using the guidance for some holding companies, that may be the service maintaining their registered office address and maintaining their services of the registered agent. However, it needs to be adequate for whatever the level of activity in relation to their equity participations is.
So in terms of the looking at a particular details in terms of the actual relevant activity, could you speak to the income? Are we looking at gross versus net income. Could you speak to that, please?
So the guidance does indicate that it's gross income that we're looking at. Of course, we're looking at the income in relation to the relevant activity itself. So not just generally the income of the entity, but it's specifically the income related to the relevant activity.
Can you speak basically, I think you would have mentioned this before, if not, I think I may have picked up on it in the guidance, tax-exempt companies. Can you just a little bit more in relation to that? Because I think there may be persons who may have some interest in relation to tax-exempt companies.
So the substance legislation, within it, it provides for cases where entities may be tax resident in another jurisdiction where they're essentially controlled and managed, and they're subject to a tax rate of 10% or higher. Mm-hmm. So when that is the case, then these entities, they are able to conduct relevant activities and are not subject to meeting the economic substance test within Anguilla. So they just need to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the registrar that they fit that criteria to be exempt, which is being tax resident and subject to tax if 10% or more in
their jurisdiction?
In the jurisdictions where they're centrally managed or controlled.
Okay. Can you speak to any untapped opportunities, anything that you may be aware of that can assist persons in this particular environment?
So, as I said earlier, it would be really capturing and internalizing the opportunities that Anguilla provides to assisting businesses with their human resource needs. Anguilla has well qualified, adequately qualified, more than adequately qualified persons able to provide additional services. The substance activities framework allows for the outsourcing of seekers. So persons can utilize the services of their registered office to provide some of the services. Obviously, there's a provision within the law that there's no double counting. So that's persons mean the employees of these third parties will not be double counted in relation to the services that they provide for several entities or in relation to several activities. But yes, it's more so just furthering your investment in Anguilla and utilizing the human resources available here.
Oh, excellent. So it's not just an opportunity for service providers as well, but more for the jurisdiction to allow growth, just overall economic growth in terms of being able to look at the future, the next step in terms of trying to get business on the ground and sort of moving in that direction.
Correct.
Excellent. So in terms of capacity building activities, can you indicate what professionals can do to get a better understanding in this particular space?
So the government has been very keen on ensuring that particularly service providers, corporate service providers, company managers, registered agents, as they will be the ones filing the returns, it has been crucial that they're aware of the requirements, that they're familiar and comfortable with what is required in order to adequately demonstrate substance in Anguilla. There is material available on the government's webpage. There was a workshop hosted in December 2018, shortly before the formation legislation was amended to provide for the substantial activities obligation. There was outreach by the government to stakeholders in the industry to familiarize them with the framework for the substantial activities requirement in Anguilla. That was videotaped, that's available. There's the guidance, there's the legislation. So the material is out there on the commercial registry's website and the government's main website. It's also provided on the competent authorities for tax purposes website as well, to make sure it's just widely available at all portals. There's also opportunities the government is looking into continuing its partnership with some of the membership organizations in the private sector to deliver in unison training opportunities, not only for their members, but for the wider public and interested persons to come to understand, to get information in relation to the substantial activities requirement itself, and ask questions and have their concerns heard. So the information is out there and the opportunities are ongoing. So, and if persons have any concerns, they can also communicate directly with the Ministry of Finance or the Commercial Registry or even the FSC, and we can see how we can address them or provide further information.
Thank you, Marisa. For the service providers, in terms of their client relationships, any particular views or comments that you can sort of provide as to how they can speak to economic substance?
I think probably one of the most important relationships through this process is the client-company manager relationship, because the obligation for substantial activities is on the client, it's on the company itself, the entity itself. However, the filing of the information to demonstrate substance is conducted by the company managers. So there needs to be open communication, open lines between the two parties to ensure, one, the company is thoroughly aware of the obligations of the law, and on the part of the company to provide its company manager with sufficient information that it can file with the registrar to be able to demonstrate substance. So I think it calls for an enhanced onboarding process by the company manager, just letting the client know up front. So this is the framework that you're subject to, these are the requirements, something that you have to be aware of. Because although the requirement to file to demonstrate substance is a once-a-year process, the requirement to have substance is an ongoing obligation. So persons need to be continually aware of this obligation.
Thank you, Marisa. This has been an excellent session in which key areas have been clarified. And what has been good from this conversation has been the defined process, so that service providers are very clear in terms of what is required. Do you have any final words on this particular topic?
It would just be to repeat what I said earlier. I know that we all, as part of our human nature, are reluctant to change, especially when we don't understand it. I would encourage persons to make themselves more aware by familiarizing themselves with the various material, the guidance. Once it's released, the draft guidance is out there now. We have the legal framework. It's made clear, it's made readily available on the government's websites. So persons are encouraged to see the jurisdiction, not just in terms of an additional obligation now, but more so additional opportunities. Reach out to your legal advisor or your company manager, or whoever is your contact within the jurisdiction, to find out Anguilla's offering. Anguilla has very competent, qualified professionals readily available to provide solutions to your business needs. We're here, we're ready to do business, and we welcome you to our shores.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Marisa. To our viewers, I hope that you found this session very enlightening. On behalf of the Anguilla Financial Services Commission, I'd like to thank you for joining us here today. This was an excellent session in terms of just enlightening persons, in particular our service providers, as to any issues surrounding economic substance. So thank you again.
Thank you, Tina. Pleased to be here, pleased to provide further information on Anguilla's regime, and I hope it helps persons become more familiar.
The Anguilla Financial Services Commission would like to thank the Ministry of Finance at the Government of Anguilla for their participation. Any references within this episode can be found in the links provided below. For more information on our FinTech licensed businesses, please contact us by email at innovate@anguilla.org. at afsc.ai.